A poor girl missed her exam to save a biker's life. That single act of mercy unleashed an unstoppable force, pulling her into a shadowy world of honor, power, and a dangerous debt. What was the terrifying price of her kindness? If you're new here, subscribe and comment your location. Now let's begin. The world dissolved into a symphony of pounding rain and the frantic, metallic thumping of her own heart. Rose's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her breath fogging the glass of her beat-up Honda Civic. The wipers slapped back and forth, a futile metronome against the downpour that threatened to wash the old county road right off the map. "Come on, come on, come on!" she chanted, a desperate prayer to the gods of academia and punctuality. Her organic chemistry final started in 45 minutes. 4 years of pre-med perfection, of late nights and sacrificed weekends, all hinged on this one exam. A scholarship, a future, a life beyond the constant grinding worry of bills. It was all waiting for her in a sterile university hall 40 miles away. A flash of lightning, closer this time, illuminated the world in a stark electric blue, and in that split second she saw it, a shape twisted and wrong in the ditch just ahead. Not a deer, a motorcycle, and a figure, massive and limp, sprawled like a broken doll in the mud and the tall, wet grass. "No," she whispered, her foot instinctively stomping on the brake. The car hydroplaned for a terrifying second, tires screaming against the asphalt before shuddering to a stop. Her first thought, a selfish, panicked spike through her veins, was, "Keep driving. Call 911 and keep driving. You can't be late." But the figure in the ditch didn't move. Cursing under her breath, a string of unrose-like expletives, she threw the car into park and flung the door open. The rain assaulted her immediately, soaking through her thin sweater, plastering her dark hair to her face. She stumbled through the slick grass, her cheap sneakers sinking into the mud. He was a giant of a man, clad head to toe in black leather, now scuffed and filthy. A patch on his cut, a skeletal winged figure, was starkly visible even in the gloom. Hell's Angel. The word sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. This wasn't just an accident, this was a problem. But he was also a human being, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. She dropped to her knees beside him, the cold mud seeping through her jeans. "Hey, can you hear me?" "Sir?" His eyes fluttered open. They were a startling pale gray, like chips of winter ice, clouded with pain but sharp with an unnerving intensity. They focused on her, and for a moment she felt pinned, like a butterfly under glass. "Reaper," he grunted, his voice a low rumble of gravel and pain. "Name's Reaper." His gaze drifted past her towards the wrecked Harley. The road, it just vanished. "Don't try to talk," Rose said, her medical training kicking in, overriding the terror. She fumbled for her phone. No service, of course, not out here. She looked back at her car, then at her watch. 25 minutes. She could still make it. She could get help and still make it. But as she moved to stand, his hand, surprisingly strong, closed around her wrist. It wasn't a threatening grip, but one of pure, primal need. His fingers were thick, calloused, a roadmap of a life she could only imagine. Blood smeared against her skin. "Don't," he rasped. "Snakes, in the grass, might still be around." The meaning dawned on her slowly, chillingly. This wasn't an accident. It was an ambush. And the people who did this might be close. Her future, the exam, the scholarship. It all crumbled in that moment, replaced by the stark, immediate reality of the man bleeding out in front of her. She couldn't leave him. The part of her that wanted to be a doctor, the part that had cared for her ailing mother until the very end, wouldn't allow it. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She pried his hand gently from her wrist and set to work, using the pocket knife on her keychain to cut away the leg of his jeans. The compound fracture was bad. the bone threatening to break through the skin. She needed to stabilize it, stop the bleeding from his head. For the next 20 minutes, she worked in a frantic, focused haze. She used the straightened-out wire of a hanger from her back seat and a torn strip of her own sweater to fashion a crude splint for his leg. She applied pressure to the head wound with a clean cloth from her gym bag. All the while, Reaper watched her, his icy eyes tracking her every move, his jaw clenched against the agony. "You're a nurse?" he managed to ask. "Pre-med," she replied, not looking up from her work. "Or I was. My final exam started 5 minutes ago." The silence that followed was heavier than the rain. He understood the magnitude of her sacrifice, a currency more valuable than any money in his world. "Why?" he finally asked. The single word loaded with a confusion that seemed alien to him. Rose finally met his gaze. "Because you needed help." It was that simple, and that complicated. An hour later, the roar of approaching motorcycles cut through the storm's cacophony. Not one or two, but a dozen. They materialized from the rain like phantom riders, massive men on gleaming chrome beasts, surrounding the scene. Rose froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The snakes had returned, but the lead rider, a mountain of a man with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that had seen too much, dismounted and rushed to Reaper's side, his face a mask of stark fear. "Jesus, Prez, we heard the chatter, came as fast as we could." Reaper gestured weakly towards Rose. "Doc, here." She stayed, patched me up. He locked eyes with his man. "She missed something important, Jax, something big. For me." Jax's hard gaze swept over Rose, taking in her drenched, shivering form, her mud-stained clothes, the bloody cloth still pressed to his president's head. The look in his eyes shifted from suspicion to something else, something profound and unyielding. Respect. The next few hours were a blur. An ambulance arrived, then a private medical helicopter that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, its authority unquestioned by the local paramedics. Reaper was loaded in, and Jax insisted Rose come with them. "The club has a debt," was all he said, his tone brooking no argument. She sat in the luxurious, sterile interior of the helicopter, watching her ruined Civic disappear below, her life veering off onto a trajectory she could never have imagined. She'd saved a man, and in doing so, she had thrown her own carefully planned future into a tailspin. The next morning, Rose woke up on an impossibly soft leather couch in a strange, minimalist apartment that Jax had provided for her. The silence was deafening. No alarm clock, no frantic rush for class, just the hollow echo of her missed opportunity. She felt numb, adrift. She made a cup of tea and stared out the floor-to-ceiling window at a city she didn't know, her future a blank, terrifying slate. And then she heard it. A low rumble, distant at first like approaching thunder. But it grew and multiplied, layering upon itself into a deafening, earth-shaking roar. She walked to the window and looked down into the street, her breath caught in her throat. The street below was not a street anymore. It was a river of denim, leather, and steel. 100, maybe more, Harley-Davidsons were parked in perfect, menacing lines. 100 large, intimidating men clad in the same winged skull cuts as Reaper stood beside their machines, their faces grim and unreadable. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. This was it. The other shoe dropping. This was the price for her involvement. She backed away from the window, her mind racing for an escape that didn't exist. A firm, deliberate knock sounded at the door. It wasn't a request, it was an announcement. Trembling, she opened it. Jack stood there, his bulk filling the doorway. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, the hallway was packed with bikers, a sea of weathered faces and silent respect. And in front of them all, leaning on a custom-made crutch but standing with an innate, kingly authority, was Reaper. His head was bandaged, his leg in a state-of-the-art cast, but his ice-chip eyes were clear and focused entirely on her. "Rose." Reaper's voice was quiet, but it carried through the tense silence like a gunshot. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, the way her hand gripped the doorframe for support. A flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossed his hardened features. "This isn't a threat, little doctor," he said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "This is an escort." Rose could only stare, her brain refusing to process the scene. "You saved my life," Reaper continued, his gaze sweeping over his men, a silent command for them to bear witness. "In my world, that creates a debt, a blood oath. It can never be repaid, but it must always be honored." He took a painful step forward, closing the distance between them. The chemistry was immediate, a live wire crackling in the space between them. He was danger and power incarnate. She was innocence and intellect. Opposites that pulled at each other with a terrifying, thrilling gravity. "You sacrificed your exam, your future for a stranger," he said, his voice dropping, becoming almost intimate. "So we're here to offer you a new one." He gestured to Jax, who handed Reaper a simple black smartphone. "The man on this screen," Reaper said, turning it towards her. The face of an older, distinguished man with sharp, intelligent eyes looked back. "Is Dr. Alistair Finch." Rose's knees went weak. Dr. Alistair Finch, the Dr. Alistair Finch, a titan of cardiovascular surgery, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in every medical school across the globe. His internship program was the stuff of legend, more exclusive than a seat on the Supreme Court. "He's expecting your call," Reaper said, pressing the phone into her numb hand. "The internship is yours. Starting next week. We've cleared the path." The sheer impossibility of it washed over her. "How? He doesn't know me? My grades, my application?" "The club has resources, Rose. Networks that exist in the shadows," Reaper explained, his tone matter-of-fact. "We don't play by the same rules as your university board. We saw wrong. We're making it right, in our own way." He looked past her into the sterile apartment. "This isn't you. Pack a bag. You're coming with us." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, and standing there, surrounded by 100 outlaws who had just offered her a dream on a silver platter, Rose felt the last vestiges of her old life slip away. She was terrified. She was exhilarated. She was in debt to the devil, and he had the face of a fallen angel named Reaper. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes locked with his. The rain was gone, replaced by the bright, terrifying sun of a new day. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Reaper's smile finally reached his eyes, transforming his harsh features into something devastatingly attractive. "To meet your new teacher." The ride was the most terrifying and thrilling experience of Rose's life. Perched on the back of Reaper's custom Harley, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, she was at the center of a rolling fortress. 100 engines roared in unison, a symphony of pure, unadulterated power that vibrated through her very bones. Cars pulled over to let the procession pass. People on the sidewalk stopped and stared, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination. She was no longer invisible pre-med student Rose. She was the girl at the center of the storm. They didn't go to a hospital or a university. They rode to a private airfield where a sleek, unmarked jet waited, its engines whining softly. The club's reach, its sheer, terrifying power, was beginning to dawn on her. This was not just a motorcycle club. This was an empire. On the flight, sitting in a plush leather seat opposite Reaper, she finally found her voice. "Why all of this?" she asked, gesturing vaguely at the jet, the implication of the 100 bikers. The phone call would have been enough. Reaper took a sip of whiskey, the ice clinking in his glass. "A phone call is a transaction, Rose. What you did was an act of courage. It deserves a response in kind. My men needed to see you. They needed to see the woman who their president owes his life to. It reinforces the code. It reminds them who we are. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. We are not the monsters the world thinks we are. We have honor. It's just a different kind. And what kind are you? She dared to ask. The kind that remembers, he said simply. Always. They landed and were driven in a convoy of black SUVs to a stunning, modern cliffside house overlooking the ocean. This was Dr. Finch's private residence and research facility. The great surgeon himself, a man in his late 60s with a commanding presence, greeted them at the door. He shook Reaper's hand like an old friend, his eyes twinkling with a knowing light. Reaper, Dr. Finch said, his voice a calm, cultured baritone. I see you're still collecting interesting projects. Alistair, Reaper replied with a nod of respect. This is the one I told you about. Rose. Dr. Finch turned his penetrating gaze on her. The girl who saved the king of the underworld and lost her finals in the process. Your transcript is adequate. But Reaper's word is better than a 4.0 GPA in my book. He tells me you have hands of a healer and the heart of a warrior. That I can work with. He smiled, a genuine warm expression. Welcome, Rose. The position is yours. Don't make me regret vouching for you. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Rose was plunged into a world of advanced medical theory and high-stakes surgical observation that made her university classes seem like child's play. Dr. Finch was a demanding, brilliant mentor, and she thrived under the pressure, her natural talent blossoming in the intense environment. And through it all, there was Reaper. He stayed in the city, overseeing his empire from a distance, but he was a constant presence in her new life. He'd show up unexpectedly at the facility, his motorcycle rumbling into the pristine silence just to check on her. They began spending time together, quiet dinners on his terrace, long walks along the cliff path as his leg healed. The chemistry between them was a palpable force. It was in the way his hand would linger on the small of her back when guiding her through a door, the way her skin prickled with awareness whenever he was near. He was a man of few words, but his eyes spoke volumes. He watched her with a possessive, simmering intensity that both frightened and thrilled her. One evening they stood on his terrace, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The air was warm, scented with salt and night-blooming jasmine. You're different from what I expected, Rose admitted, sipping a glass of wine. The national president of the Hells Angels. I thought you'd be louder. Reaper chuckled, a low, rich sound that vibrated through her. The loudest ones in the room are usually the weakest. Power is quiet, Rose. It's in the space between words. It's in the decisions you make when no one is watching. He turned to look at her, his profile silhouetted against the dying light. Like your decision to stop on that road. I almost didn't, she confessed, the shame of that initial thought still fresh. But you did, he said, his voice dropping. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. That's what defines you, not the thought, but the action. He leaned in, and the world narrowed to the space between their lips. It was a kiss that was nothing like she had ever experienced. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was claiming, passionate, a conflagration of all the pent-up tension that had been building between them. It tasted of whiskey, danger, and a desperate, surprising kind of hope. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. This is a bad idea, she whispered, her forehead resting against his. The worst, he agreed, his thumb stroking her cheek. But it's the only one that feels right. Their clandestine romance became the secret heartbeat of her new life. Stolen moments of searing passion in his penthouse, charged with an intensity that left her breathless and utterly consumed. He was a skilled, demanding lover, his touch both commanding and reverent, as if he was memorizing her. He would map the freckles on her shoulders with a focus usually reserved for territorial disputes, and she would trace the intricate tattoos that told the story of a life lived in violence and brotherhood, learning the history written on his skin. It was a world away from the sterile, bright lights of the operating room, and she was losing herself in him piece by piece. But the real world, Reaper's world, was never far away. One night they were having dinner at a small, exclusive restaurant he owned, a legitimate front for less legitimate enterprises. The maitre d', a club prospect named Leo, was visibly nervous. Rose had learned to read the subtle signs of tension in Reaper's world. The too quiet conversations, the specific way Jax would adjust his cut, the cold stillness that would fall over Reaper himself. Halfway through their meal, Jax approached the table and leaned down, whispering something in Reaper's ear. Rose saw his knuckles whiten around his steak knife. His expression didn't change, but the air around him turned to ice. "It seems our dinner is being cut short, little doctor," Reaper said, his voice dangerously calm. He stood, throwing his napkin on the table. "Leo, take Rose back to the penthouse. Now, Jax with me." "What's happening?" Rose asked, fear clutching her heart. "A minor dispute," Reaper said, his eyes already looking past her, towards the door, towards the coming storm. "A rival club, the Vipers, got ambitious. They thought because I was distracted, they could move in on our turf." He bent down, his lips brushing her ear, his voice a whisper that was both a promise and a threat. "They were mistaken." He kissed her hard and quick, a brand of possession. "Go with Leo. Don't open the door for anyone but me." She was rushed out a back entrance and into a waiting car. That night, alone in his penthouse, she heard the news reports. A massive, violent clash between two motorcycle gangs in the industrial district. Several casualties, no names released. He didn't come back until the next morning. She was asleep on the couch, and medical textbook open on her lap. The sound of the door opening woke her. He stood there, silhouetted in the dawn light. He was still wearing the same clothes, now rumpled and stained with dirt and something darker. There was a fresh cut on his cheekbone, and a grim finality in his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, and in that look, she saw the abyss. She saw the man who presided over this violent, unforgiving world, the man who had just, in all likelihood, ended lives to protect his own. He walked over to the bar and poured 2 fingers of whiskey, downing it in one go. The silence was suffocating. "Are you okay?" she finally asked, her voice small. He turned, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her worried expression, her rumpled clothes. The hardness in his eyes softened just a fraction. "This is what I am, Rose," he said, his voice raw. "This is the life. It's not just the money, the power, the respect, it's blood. It's making decisions that would give a man like your Dr. Finch nightmares." He gestured to the city waking up below. "The peace you enjoy in this penthouse, the future I'm giving you with Finch. It's paid for with moments like last night. You need to understand that. You can't romanticize this." Tears welled in her eyes, not of fear, but of a profound, heartbreaking understanding. She walked over to him, stopping just inches away. She could smell the night on him, gunpowder, sweat, and violence. "I'm not romanticizing it," she whispered, reaching up to touch the fresh cut on his face. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "I see you, Reaper. All of you." He captured her hand, pressing her palm against his chest, right over the winged skull patch and the pounding human heart beneath it. His defenses crumbled. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in his collapsing world. They stood like that for a long time, the healer and the destroyer bound together by a debt and something infinitely more dangerous, love. The crisis with the Vipers solidified Reaper's power but left a scar on their fragile relationship. Rose threw herself into her work with Dr. Finch, achieving a level of surgical precision that amazed her mentor. She was assisting on a complex bypass procedure, her hands steady and sure, when she realized she had found her calling not in spite of the chaos surrounding her, but almost because of it. In the operating room, she found the same focused intensity, the same life-or-death stakes that defined Reaper's world. She was, in her own way, learning to command her own kind of power. Weeks turned into a month. The internship was nearing its end, and with it the unspoken question of what would happen next hung between them. The debt was paid. Her future was secure. There was no reason for their worlds to remain entwined. They were at his penthouse, the city lights spread out below them like a field of diamonds. The air was thick with unspoken words. "Finch wants me to stay," Rose said quietly, breaking the silence. "He's offered me a full residency, a permanent position on his team." Reaper stood by the window, his back to her. He didn't turn. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? A future far greater than any exam." "It is," she said, her voice trembling. "But—" He finally turned. The raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes shocked her. "But it's a future here, and my life, my empire, is elsewhere." He took a step towards her. "I can't give this up, Rose. I won't. This club is my blood, it's my family, it's who I am." "I know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face now. "And I would never ask you to." "Then what are we doing?" he asked, the question hanging in the air, fragile and terrifying. It was then that Jax burst in, his face urgent. "Prez, we have a problem. It's the Vipers, the ones who got away. They didn't come for us. They took Mercy." Mercy was Jax's 16-year-old daughter, a sweet, shy girl Rose had met on several occasions. She'd baked Rose cookies once, blushing when Rose complimented her. Reaper's entire demeanor transformed. The vulnerable man was gone, replaced by the ruthless president. The air crackled with lethal intent. "Where?" "We don't know. They're demanding we cede the entire waterfront. They have her somewhere in the old shipyards. They said if we bring the whole club, they'll—" Jax couldn't finish. His massive hands clenched into fists of pure rage and helplessness. "We can't storm the place," Reaper said, his mind working with a cold, strategic clarity. "It's a maze. They'll hear us coming a mile away and they'll kill her." He looked at Jax, his second, his brother, who was falling apart. "We need a different approach." Rose's mind, trained for diagnostics and solving complex problems under pressure, was racing. The shipyards. She'd studied the area for an urban triage project with Dr. Finch. It was a labyrinth of rusting hulls and crumbling warehouses. "I can get in," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Both men turned to stare at her as if she'd grown a second head. "Absolutely not," Reaper snarled, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Listen to me," Rose insisted, stepping forward. "There's a storm drain system. It runs right under the main dry dock. Finch's team surveyed it for a public health map. I have the schematics on my tablet. It comes up in a maintenance closet in the central warehouse. I can get in unseen. I can find her, assess her condition, and get a location to you." "It's too dangerous," Jax said, but there was a desperate hope in his eyes. "They're looking for 100 bikers, not one woman," Rose argued, her gaze locked on Reaper. "You said it yourself. I have the heart of a warrior. Let me prove it. For Mercy." Reaper looked at her, and she saw the war in his eyes. The president who needed to protect his asset, and the man who loved the fierce, brilliant woman standing before him. He saw the same determined resolve that had made her stay with a bleeding stranger in a ditch. "Jax," Reaper said, his voice a low command. "Get her the schematics, and get her a wire." He walked over to Rose, cupping her face in his hands. His touch was desperate. "You find her. You tell us where she is. You do not engage. You are a scout, not a soldier. Do you understand me? If anything happens to you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Nothing will happen," she said, standing on her toes to kiss him. It was a kiss of promise, of defiance, of love. "Trust me." An hour later, Rose was crawling through a pitch-black, damp concrete tunnel. The smell of stagnant water and rust thick in her nostrils. A tiny headlamp was her only guide, and the whisper-thin wire taped to her chest was her only connection to Reaper. She could hear his tense, quiet breathing in the tiny earpiece. "You're clear for the next 50 yards, little doctor," his voice came through, a steady anchor in the terrifying darkness. "Then you take a left. The manhole cover should be directly above you." She moved with a quiet grace she didn't know she possessed, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. She found the ladder and climbed slowly, carefully pushing up the heavy cover just enough to peer out. She was in a dimly lit maintenance closet just as the schematics had shown. The sound of voices, loud and rough, echoed from the main warehouse floor. "I'm in," she whispered. "We have your signal. Be careful." She crept to the door, cracking it open a sliver. She could see Mercy tied to a chair in the center of the vast empty space, her face pale and tear-streaked. 4 Vipers were with her, armed, laughing and drinking, their guard down. They never expected a rescue attempt from within. Rose's eyes, trained for detail, scanned the scene. One man had a pronounced limp, favoring his right leg. Another was constantly scratching at a rash on his neck. A third had a nasty, untreated gash on his forearm, red and inflamed. The fourth, the one who seemed to be in charge, had the cold, dead eyes of a predator. She relayed it all in a hushed whisper, her voice clinical and calm. 4 hostiles. Alpha has a handgun tucked in his waistband at the back. Bravo has the limp, possible old injury. Charlie has an infected cut on his left arm. Delta is the scratcher. Mercy appears unharmed, just terrified. Back in the command SUV parked a mile away, Reaper and Jax listened, a map of the warehouse spread out before them. Jax was staring at the audio feed as if his life depended on it. "The infection on Charlie's arm," Rose whispered. "It's bad. Cellulitis, maybe even early sepsis. He's weak. He'll be the first to break under pressure." Reaper's voice came back, filled with a new kind of respect. "Copy that, little doctor. Good intel. Now we're moving in. We'll come through the north and west bays. When you hear the first shot, you hit the deck and stay down. Understood?" "Understood." She waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The seconds stretched into an eternity. She watched the man called Charlie wince as he moved his arm. She saw the leader, Alpha, check his watch impatiently. Then all hell broke loose. The massive North Bay door exploded inwards, torn from its rails by the sheer force of a pickup truck. At the same moment, the west door was kicked open. The warehouse was suddenly filled with the roaring presence of 24 Hell's Angels, led by Reaper and Jax. The air was split with the sound of shouting, the cocking of guns, and the Vipers' panicked curses. Rose dropped to the floor as a shot rang out, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. A full-on firefight erupted. She saw Reaper, moving with a predator's grace, disarm and incapacitate the limping Bravo with brutal efficiency. Jax, a man possessed, charged directly towards Alpha, who was using Mercy as a human shield. But the Viper leader was quick. He pressed his gun to Mercy's temple. "Back off, Jax, or I paint the walls with her." Everything froze. The shooting stopped. The only sound was Mercy's terrified whimpers. It was then that Rose saw her chance. Charlie, the one with the infected arm, had been knocked behind a stack of crates near her closet, disoriented and clutching his wounded, feverish limb. He was separated from the standoff. Rose didn't think. She acted. She slipped out of the closet, her medical bag in hand. In 3 quick strides, she was behind Charlie. He heard her and started to turn, but he was slow, sick. Before he could raise his weapon, she jammed a pre-filled syringe of a powerful sedative into the infected flesh of his arm and depressed the plunger. His eyes went wide with shock, then rolled back in his head as he collapsed to the ground. The sudden movement caught Alpha's eye. He spun, his gun swinging away from Mercy and towards Rose. "You!" In that split second, with his focus broken, Jax lunged. He tackled Alpha with a roar of pure fury, sending the gun skittering across the concrete floor. The fight was over in seconds. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged breaths of the men and Mercy's sobs as Jax untied her and crushed her in a bear hug. Reaper stood amidst the chaos, his eyes finding Rose. She was standing over the sedated biker, her chest heaving, the empty syringe still in her hand. She met his gaze across the warehouse floor. In that moment, she wasn't the girl he needed to protect. She was the woman who had just helped save the day. She was an asset. She was, in every way that mattered, one of them. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't stop until he was right in front of her. He didn't say a word. He just took her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, and kissed her. It was a kiss of possession, of pride, of a love that had been forged in fire and sealed in blood. It was a kiss that held the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. Later, back at the clubhouse, a massive, raucous celebration was underway. Mercy was safe, the Vipers were broken, and Rose was hailed as a hero. She was no longer just Reaper's girl. She was Doc, a name spoken with the same respect they gave their most hardened members. She stood on the periphery, watching the scene, the laughter, the camaraderie, the sheer, vibrant, dangerous life of it all. Reaper found her, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. "You were magnificent today," he murmured into her hair. She leaned into his solid strength, looking out at the family she had, against all odds, become a part of. She thought of her sterile, bright future with Dr. Finch. It was everything she had ever worked for. But it was a solo path. This here was messy, dangerous, and unpredictable. But it was also alive. It was family. It was love. Reaper turned her to face him, his expression serious. "The debt is paid, Rose, 100 times over. You're free. You can go to your residency with Finch. You can have the life you always dreamed of. No one would blame you." She looked up at him, at this complicated, violent, honorable man who had stormed into her life with 100 bikers and turned it upside down. She saw her future in his winter-gray eyes. It wasn't the future she had planned. It was better. It was real. She reached up and touched the patch on his cut, her fingers tracing the winged skull. "That life was a dream, Reaper," she said, her voice clear and sure. This is waking up." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a sight so rare and beautiful it made her heart ache. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as the music and the roar of his family surrounded them. She had missed an exam to save a Hell's Angel, and in return she had found not just a future, but a destiny. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The roar in the clubhouse was a living entity, thrumming through the worn floorboards and vibrating in the chest of every soul present. It was a symphony of victory, of relief, of a bond tested and proven unbreakable. For Rose, standing within the eye of this hurricane of denim and leather, the sound was both alien and intoxicating. It was the polar opposite of the hushed, sterile silence of an operating room, and yet it held the same undercurrent of life and death stakes. Jax, his face still flushed with the adrenaline of the rescue, clinked a bottle of whiskey against the others, his voice booming over the din. "To Doc!" he roared, his eyes, usually so hard, shining with a moisture he didn't bother to hide. He wrapped his other arm tightly around his daughter, Mercy, who was tucked safely under his wing, her small frame still trembling slightly. The woman who walks through hell with a syringe and a steady hand. 100 voices echoed the toast, the sound crashing over Rose like a wave. Glasses were raised in her direction. Grizzled faces, scarred and weathered, broke into genuine, grateful smiles. She was no longer just Reaper's unexpected guest. She was one of their own. The name Doc was no longer a tentative label, but a title, earned in blood and fear. Reaper stood beside her, his presence a solid, warm anchor in the chaos. His arm was draped possessively around her waist, his fingers splayed against her hip. He didn't join the toast verbally, but his gaze, when she looked up at him, said everything. It was a look of fierce pride, of awe, and a possessiveness that sent a thrill down her spine. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. "You realize you can never leave now, right?" he murmured, a hint of dark humor in his tone. "They'd mutiny. I'd have a rebellion on my hands led by my own VP. Rose smiled, a true unburdened smile that reached her eyes. "Who said anything about leaving?" His arm tightened around her. The question that had hung between them for weeks, the what happens next, had been answered in that warehouse. Her future wasn't a path away from him, it was a road they would carve out together, no matter how treacherous. Later, when the celebration had simmered to a low, contented hum and most of the brothers had staggered off to their beds or their bikes, Rose and Reaper found themselves alone on the back patio of the clubhouse. It overlooked a scarred, empty parking lot, but the sky above was a tapestry of endless stars, unobscured by city lights. The air was cool, carrying the scent of desert sage and gasoline. He was sitting on a wooden bench, his bad legs stretched out in front of him. Without a word, Rose knelt in front of him, her medical bag, now a permanent fixture in his world, open beside her. She carefully unwrapped the bandage on his leg. The wound from the initial accident was healing well, but the frantic action of the night had reopened a small part of it. "You should have let me look at this before you went charging into a firefight," she chided softly, her touch clinical yet gentle as she cleaned the inflamed skin. He watched her work, the concentration on her face illuminated by the single bare bulb above the door. "There wasn't time," he said simply, "and some things are more important than a few stitches." She finished applying a fresh antiseptic salve and began rewrapping it with a practiced efficiency. "Mercy is safe, that's what matters." "That's not what I meant," he said, his voice dropping. He reached out, his fingers under her chin, tilting her face up to his. The intensity in his gray eyes was breathtaking. "I meant you." The word hung between them, charged and potent. "When that bastard turned his gun on you," Reaper continued, his thumb stroking her jawline, his voice rough with a remembered terror that shook Rose to her core. "For a second, Rose, everything stopped. The whole world. I saw his finger on the trigger and I was 1,000 miles away. I've faced down death more times than I can count. I've never been afraid. Not until that moment." Tears pricked at Rose's eyes. This man, this king of a brutal empire, was confessing a vulnerability he would show no one else. He was letting her see the crack in his armor, and it was the most powerful thing she had ever witnessed. "I'm okay," she whispered, covering his hand with hers. "You trained me well. Scout, not a soldier, remember?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You were a terrible scout, a brilliant, reckless, magnificent soldier." He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. "I can't lose you, Rose, I won't." It was a vow, a declaration that went far beyond the code of honor that had first bound them. This was something deeper, something primal. "You won't," she promised, her voice firm despite the emotion clogging her throat. He kissed her then, and it was different from any kiss they had shared before. It wasn't about passion, though that simmered beneath the surface. It was about sealing a pact. It was a kiss of commitment, of a future acknowledged and chosen. When they finally broke apart, the world felt new, the boundaries of their lives irrevocably redrawn. The following week was a study in surreal contrasts. Rose returned to Dr. Finch's state-of-the-art facility. The crisp, clean air a stark contrast to the smoky, gasoline-scented atmosphere of the clubhouse. She stood beside the great surgeon in an operating theater, her hands once stained with the grime of a storm drain, now scrubbed sterile, performing intricate, life-saving maneuvers on a human heart. During a break, Dr. Finch cornered her in the scrub room. "Your technique has improved, Rose," he remarked, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "There's a new confidence, a steadiness I hadn't seen before. It's as if you've stared down something that truly frightened you and found you were equal to it." Rose met his gaze in the mirror, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Something like that, sir." "And your benefactor?" Finch asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I assume the matter that required your sudden departure has been resolved." "It has," Rose said, turning to face him, her posture straight. "Permanently." Finch nodded slowly, a look of deep understanding in his eyes. He was a man who operated in the world of absolutes, life and death, diseased tissue and healthy. But he was not a naive man. He knew the world existed in shades of gray. Good. A distracted mind is a surgeon's greatest enemy, and a protected heart is her greatest asset. He gave her a long, appraising look. "The residency is yours whenever you're ready. But I have a proposal." He led her to his office and laid out a blueprint, not for a building but for a foundation. A mobile surgical unit, taking advanced trauma care to underserved areas. Rural towns, inner cities, and places where people like your friends might not feel comfortable walking into a place like this. He looked at her pointedly. "It would require a director with surgical skill, nerves of steel, and an understanding of unconventional communities. I can't think of anyone better suited." Rose's heart soared. It was the perfect synthesis of her two worlds. It was a way to use the skills Finch had given her to help the people Reaper loved. It was a future she could build with him, not in spite of him. That evening, she brought the plans back to Reaper's penthouse. He spread them out on the large oak table, his large calloused hands tracing the lines of the proposed mobile unit with a surprising reverence. "This is it, isn't it?" he said, his voice low. "Your way to fix the world." "A very small part of it," she corrected, coming to stand beside him. "Our way. This would need funding, logistics, security in some of those neighborhoods. Things a motorcycle club might be better at arranging than a hospital board." He looked at her, a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "We can do that. The club has more money than it knows what to do with, most of it legit now. And there isn't a neighborhood in this country where the sight of our cut doesn't command a certain respect." He kissed the top of her head. "This is brilliant, Rose. This is a legacy." For the first time, Rose felt a sense of wholeness. The pre-med student who had agonized over a missed exam was gone. In her place was a woman who had found a purpose that encompassed all of who she was. The healer, the partner, the ally. Their peace, however, was a delicate thing in Reaper's world. A week later, the threat came, not from a rival club, but from within the labyrinth of his own empire. A high-stakes shipment, a key part of their legitimate import-export business, had been hijacked. The loss was significant, but the insult was greater. It was a challenge to Reaper's authority, a whisper that he was distracted, softened by his new relationship. The tension in the clubhouse was a palpable, toxic fog. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a watchful, suspicious silence. Reaper sat at the head of the large table in the church room, his council of senior members around him. Rose was there, not as a guest, but at Reaper's insistence. "You see things we don't, Doc," he told her. "Your mind works differently. The suspects were two brothers, Hawk and Cobra, who had been responsible for the route. They stood before the table, their faces set in defiant masks. But Rose, trained to read the subtle signs of the human body, saw the telltale flicker of fear in Hawk's eyes, the way Cobra's Adam's apple bobbed nervously. The interrogation was harsh, a verbal bludgeoning led by Jax. Denials were met with cold, hard logic about timelines and routes. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. "It was the Vipers," Cobra finally spat out, desperation edging his voice. "They must have had a man on the inside. We were set up." Reaper, who had been silent throughout, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, which made it all the more terrifying. "The Vipers are broken. Their inside men are in the ground." He leaned forward, his icy gaze pinning first Hawk, then Cobra. "There's no one left to set you up, which means the betrayal came from in here." The room went deathly quiet. This was the worst kind of sin in their world, treason against the club. It was then that Rose noticed something everyone else had missed. Hawk, the older brother, kept glancing not at Reaper or Jax, but at a quiet, unassuming man named Paul, the club's treasurer. It was a fleeting look, a silent plea. And Paul, who had been meticulously cleaning his fingernails with a switchblade, gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Rose's mind, the diagnostician, connected the symptoms. The financial loss would impact the club's treasury. Paul had access. Hawk and Cobra were taking the fall, but they were terrified of someone else. She leaned over and whispered in Reaper's ear, her voice barely a breath. "It's not just them. Look at Paul. Hawk is looking at him for permission to speak." Reaper's eyes didn't flicker. He didn't turn to look at Paul. But the focus of his energy shifted. The atmosphere in the room changed, the pressure dropping as if before a storm. "Hawk," Reaper said, his tone conversational. "You have a daughter, don't you? Cute kid, blonde hair, 6 years old." Hawk's face went ashen. "Leave her out of this." "I'd like to," Reaper said. "A man will do desperate things to protect his family. He'll take the fall for a crime he didn't commit if he's being threatened." His head turned slowly, deliberately, until his gaze fell on Paul. The room's attention swung with it. "Wouldn't you agree, Paul?" Paul froze, the switchblade still in his hand. "I don't know what you're talking about, Reaper." "See, that's the thing," Reaper continued, standing up and walking around the table with a predator's grace. "The financials on this shipment. They were a little too perfect. The loss a little too convenient. You've been skimming, Paul, for a while. And when this shipment came along, you saw a chance to make a big score and pin it on these two. You threatened their families to ensure their silence." The truth, laid out with such cold precision, shattered the last of Paul's composure. With a snarl, he lunged, not at Reaper, but at Rose, the perceived weakest link, the source of his undoing. The world slowed down. Rose saw the glint of the switchblade, saw the hatred in Paul's eyes, but before a scream could form in her throat, Reaper moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast to follow. There was a sickening crack, the clatter of the knife on the concrete floor, and Paul was on his knees, howling in pain, his arm bent at a grotesque angle. Reaper stood over him, his boot on Paul's back, his face a mask of cold, murderous fury. "You ever?" Reaper's voice was a whisper that cut through the room like a whip. "You ever raise a hand to what's mine again, and your death will be a lesson this club will tell stories about for 100 years. He looked at Jax. "Get him out of my sight. Deal with it." As Paul was dragged, screaming, from the room, Reaper turned his attention back to Hawk and Cobra. The fury was gone, replaced by a stern, judicial calm. "You betrayed the club by your silence. You're off the route. You're on cleanup duty for a year. And if anything happens to Doc, I'll hold you both personally responsible. Understood?" The brothers nodded, their relief so profound they looked ready to collapse. They had been given a second chance, a mercy they never expected. It was a decision that cemented Reaper's authority not as a tyrant, but as a just leader. And it was a decision made, Rose knew, because of her. He had shown mercy to protect her, to ensure no one would ever see her as a target again. Later that night, wrapped in the safety of his arms in their bed, Rose traced the lines of tension that still lingered on his brow. "You knew it was Paul all along, didn't you?" she whispered. "I had my suspicions," he admitted, his voice rough with exhaustion. "But I needed to see the play. I needed to know who was involved." He turned to look at her, his eyes soft in the moonlight. "But you saw it in a heartbeat. You saw the fear. You read them like one of your medical charts." "It's the same principle," she said softly. "Diagnosing the problem, looking past the obvious symptoms to find the root cause." He kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of gratitude and an overwhelming love. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Rose. To this club. You make us better. You make me better." As she drifted to sleep, nestled against the solid, steady beat of his heart, Rose knew there would always be storms in their world. There would always be threats from outside and from within, but she was no longer afraid of the darkness. She had learned to navigate it, to find her way through its treacherous paths. She had traded the predictable future of an exam schedule for the chaotic, vibrant, dangerous one and profoundly beautiful reality of a life lived with honor, with family, and with a love that was as unbreakable as it was unexpected. She had saved a Hell's Angel, and in doing so, she had finally found her way home. Thank you for watching. Her one choice changed everything. What would you have done? Would you have the courage to choose a stranger over your own future? Let us know yes or no in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.